How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to Set 6, and today we're going to get back to the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth chat. We've done a couple of other videos over the last few days, so make sure you check them out. We've got a new series going where I'm going to do, like, tips for old RPGs, new RPGs, stuff like that. Just stuff for everything. I'm trying to broaden my horizons a little bit. So, you know, give them a look, give them a like. But, back to Rebirth. And today, we're going to talk about Genesis. Because a few of us expected to see Genesis in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and we didn't. And it leaves me with a couple of questions, one being, like, what's going on with Genesis? Are we even going to see Genesis? Because we're coming into the third game now, and it's very possible that we may not. But not only that, if we are going to see Genesis, what are the most likely avenues to see him? So, we're going back to the format of the old videos. You remember when I used to put 3 ideas out there for what I think is possible? Yeah, we're going back to that. And the ideas today are going to be about what's going on with Genesis. So, like the video, subscribe for future content, but let's just jump into it. Also, I don't think I have to say this, but spoilers. Full spoilers for Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VII Remake, Rebirth, Crisis Core Reunion, just spoilers. Now, for those of you who don't know who Genesis is, really briefly, Genesis is one of the original crop of soldiers. If you've played Crisis Core, you know who Genesis is, but he was one of the products of Project G, which was one of the branches of the Genova Project, the branch that ended up losing to Project S, basically, because Project S was better, it produced Sephiroth. But throughout Crisis Core, we see Genesis interacting with Zack and other characters in the game, we see him going through degradation, we have all the business with Loveless and the blessing of the goddess and things like that, and by the end of Crisis Core, Genesis has been collected by VII and Nero from Deepground, who we've already met in the Remake project. They've tried to bring him into the fold as part of Deepground, but Genesis has refused and sealed himself in an underground cave beneath Midgar. And then the final thing that we see of Genesis in the timeline is at the end of Dirge of Cerberus, where Vice has been defeated and Omega has been defeated, and Vice is in an underground cave beneath Midgar, and Genesis wakes up, picks him up, and says, "We have much left to do, brother," and just flies off into the night. That's the very last thing that we see of Genesis, and that completes your crash course on Genesis. There's a lot more depth to it, there's a lot more stuff to do with Loveless, and I will preface this now by saying, whichever of these possibilities comes true, if any of them, all of them will end up filled with Loveless references and Blessing of the Goddess talk and everything like that. I feel like it's a separate subject to where Genesis is going to appear, if he's going to appear. Like, no matter where he appears, Loveless is going to be a part of it, so we'll talk about that later. We're just going to talk about how. And the first possibility, the most basic possibility of the three, is that he is in Midgar. He's just chilling in Midgar, and when we eventually return to Midgar, because I do feel like the main beats of Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 will still do what Part 1 and 2 have done, we'll still probably hit the main locations and the main events that we hit, things will just be different, and I think more stuff will happen than happened in the OG, but I digress. So we will return to Midgar at some point, I think that's pretty much a guarantee, and it could make sense that we interact with Genesis and other members of Deepground potentially when we return to Midgar. That feels like the simplest thing. Feels a little bit boring though. It feels like they'll have wasted a little bit of potential maybe with Deepground. I mean, obviously it depends on what they do with Deepground and Genesis in Midgar. But yeah, that feels like probably the most plausible, obvious, basic suggestion for how we're going to see Genesis and Deepground again. Because we're definitely going to see Deepground again. They made sure that they put Deepground in front of us in Yuffie's trial when we were in the Temple of the Ancients. She goes through the whole thing with Sonon and Nero and everything like that. So that suggests to me that we are going to see Deepground again. So yeah, option 1, Midgar. Pretty basic. Probably the easy option if they just want to wrap it up. Now, the second possibility is a little bit more interesting. So at the end of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, we see Zack. And we see that Zack is in a church where all of the flowers are blooming, which suggests that it is a world that has got an abundance of energy still. Because we saw in the ending of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the worlds that were close to their end had no Mako, had no life, the plants had stopped blooming, the well of the Mako reactor was empty, things like that. even the church floating in the live stream that Zack ends up arriving on, you know, the half-destroyed one, that's got the circle of flowers, but most of them are dead except for one, and it gives its last bit of energy just to heal Zack and make sure he's at full power ready for the fight against Bizarro Sephiroth. But like I say, at the end, we see him in a world that's got energy still, seemingly. Now, one suggestion is that he has now been transferred back to the Beagle world. There's also the possibility that he's in the OG world, if that's a separate thing to the Beagle world, which is a different video. But the gist of it is that Zack seems to be in a Midgar that is full of energy. And if he's in a Midgar that's full of energy, what's to say that whether it's the Beagle world, the OG world, or another fabricated world with a different dog, what's to say that Genesis doesn't pop up and interact with Zack through that medium? Because in Crisis Core, there are a lot of interactions between Zack and Genesis. Zack basically is part of the process of healing Genesis in the final stages of the game, and it would make sense in a lot of ways if we were to have Genesis and Zack interacting with each other. Now, like I say, I'm not sure what world that would be in, but whichever one, it would definitely work. So that's the first two options, and if you were to give me a choice of the two, I'd take the second one. I think Genesis and Zack's dynamic could be very good. I think Genesis and Zack interacting in one of these errant worlds, or the real world, or whatever it may be, would be an interesting dynamic. Like I say, I feel like the first option's a little bit on the basic side. That's just the... You know when in Rebirth Leslie popped up and it was very much a throwaway quest just to remind us that Leslie existed? I feel like the first idea could probably end up being the equivalent of that. Deepground will pop up for a minute, Genesis will be there, and then we'll beat them and they'll go away. That's what I'm worried about it being if it's just that. Whereas if we see Zack and Genesis interacting over the course of the game, it'll be a much longer term thing, because I feel like they'll probably do a similar thing in Part 3 to what they did in Rebirth with Zack. You know, and kind of keep popping back to him and seeing what he's up to. Keep popping back to him and learning a little bit more. I think that'd be the way that they go. But there is a third option. And this is probably my favourite one. We already know that there's going to be a massive escalation to the situation in Wutai. Or at least that's what it seems like. We've got Glenn and this whole war for the Magnus materia that's going on between Wutai and Shinra. We are already seeing a big escalation of that in Rebirth, and it was even happening in Remake. You know, you could hear the whispers of it in Remake. Whispers. But in Part 3, we're going to go to Wutai. At least I'm pretty certain we're going to go to Wutai. I'd be shocked if we didn't, because there's so many things pointing us in that direction. And one of our party members, Yuffie, obviously has a big interest in going back to Wutai and making sure everything's cool and, you know, working out what to do next, because she's seen this incident that happened at the Nebo reactor with Wutai troops turning up, and she was thrown by that. She was like, whoa, why have I not been told about this? What's going on? So she's got questions that need answering, and I feel like because of a lot of the events that happen at the end of Rebirth, you kind of forget about that because it's a very minor thing in the grand scheme of things, but she's definitely going to want to go back there. So if she goes back to Wutai, and it's almost a guarantee Scarlet's going to be heavily involved in whatever goes down in Wutai, that feels like a perfect opportunity for Deepground to be deployed. Bring them over to Wutai, get them away from the main events of the main story, and let them be massively involved in this expanded Wutai story that we've got going on. And if Deepground come along for the party, what's to say that Genesis doesn't? I think that could be a very strong possibility. We could see a combination of option 2 and option 3, to be fair. We could see Genesis interacting with Zack via the worlds, and we could still see Deepground heavily involved in Wutai. I think that's a very strong option, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. But yeah, they're kind of my ideas on how and where we could see Genesis and Deepground become involved in Part 3. I think it's a guarantee that Deepground are going to be involved in some capacity. I'm 50-50 on Genesis. I think there is a world where we don't see Genesis at all. I'd be shocked, but I think there is a world where we do not see Genesis pop up at all. Maybe it'll be hand-waved away and explained in some kind of exposition at some point. But yeah, I don't think there's a guarantee that we see Genesis. I think there's a guarantee that we see Deepground. I'm confident that we see Deepground again. And like I say, shocked if we don't see Genesis, but I'd be able to understand it. It's another thread that they'd just be opening up. Another facet to this is, do they bring Loveless further to the forefront? And do we see more of this imagery that maybe suggests that there's a correlation between the goddess, Minerva, and Genova? If we see more of that, I think then the case for Genesis appearing becomes a bit stronger, because he'd give us additional context around that. But yeah, I'm kind of thinking that the Zack option might be the most likely for how we see Genesis now going forwards in part 3. I think we see him interacting with Zack, and it's like a separate thread, similar to the thread that we saw in Rebirth with Zack and Biggs. I think that's probably the most likely avenue, but it's not just about what I think, it's about what you think as well. So let me know what you're thinking in the comments below. Will we see Genesis? Will we see Deepground? And how will we see either of the two? Let me know your thoughts, like the video, share for future content. Don't forget to check out some of the other videos on the channel, because I am going to start covering a more diverse array of games. RPGs still, obviously, but I am going to start covering some other stuff as well. But there's always going to be Final Fantasy content. This isn't going to be replacing Final Fantasy content, it's going to be as well as Final Fantasy content, so you don't have to worry about that. But yeah, like, sub, share, watch other stuff, but more importantly than all of that, have a great day.